I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, and my talk is in two halves. And the first part is structured as if it were a conversation with a climate skeptic. And then in the second part, well, during that part, I'm going to argue that climate change is a very real, urgent issue, and it is something that architects need to address. And then in the second part, I'm going to look at one possible way in which architects can respond to the challenge of climate change. So starting with that first one, the conversation with the skeptic, and incidentally, I'm going to come on to that point about the 7,000 signatories, which is quite a good one. So this is going to start with some very basic positions. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because I guess some of you are pretty familiar with this. Those of you who do know these arguments, I'd like to suggest that you maybe refamiliarize yourself with some of these and think about how you might use these arguments yourself if you had to argue with a climate change skeptic. So this is going to start with very basic positions, working through to the much more complicated ones. And the most basic position is this one. I'm not convinced that climate change is even happening. And there are one or two people who still seem to hold this position. And actually, we have incredibly good data about how temperature and CO2 levels have varied over the last 600,000 years. And a lot of that comes from the Vostok ice data. So this ice was laid down in layers over the years, and as it was laid down, it trapped little bubbles within it. And so you can take a very accurate reading of the CO2 levels from that. And then by comparing the isotopes of oxygen, you can arrive at a pretty accurate picture of what the temperature was at the time. And what you see is that there's a very close correlation between temperature and carbon dioxide. And where we are now is at about just above where it says present concentration. We're at about 385 parts per million. And that's higher than it's been for about 3 million years. And with business as usual, it's going to carry on going up and up. And we know that CO2 is not the only greenhouse gas, and it's certainly not the most potent one, but it is the one that is emitted in by far the largest quantities. So I think it is the most significant one that we should talk about in terms of causing climate change. And we're already seeing a very significant increase in the frequency and the intensity of extreme weather events, not just hurricanes, but also floods and droughts and so on. And we also know from controlled experiments that CO2 is a greenhouse gas. It reflects the heat, and it does produce buildup of heat within the atmosphere. So there's actually very little doubt that climate change is happening. We know that CO2 is a greenhouse gas. We know that CO2 levels have been increasing. We know that global temperatures have been increasing. So those who say that the case has not been proven 100%, and generally those are in some of the more sort of skeptical parts of the media, I'd suggest they don't really understand the nature of the science. Because with something as complex as the global climate system, you're never going to get 100% proof. But the overwhelming balance of scientific information suggests that climate change is happening. So the next skeptical position is, okay, climate change is happening, but it's not caused by humans. And that figure that the gentleman who was sitting at the front mentioned, the petition of 7,000 climate scientist signatories, well, that's known as the Oregon petition. And George Monbiot wrote quite an amusing piece about this. He's actually such a thorough journalist that he looked through the list of signatories and found that it included people such as Ginger Spice and a lot of others with comparable levels of scientific knowledge. And it's been comprehensively debunked, and it was brought about by a fundamentalist Christian organization. So, I'd really forget about that one. There are one or two slightly more convincing skeptical positions that fit into this one. And the two most common ones are that it's to do with solar fluctuation, or it's the result of natural sources of CO2. So let's have a look at each of those. Now, the first one, well, we certainly don't have records of solar intensity anywhere near as extensive as the Vostok ice data. But we do have records going back about 400 years. And there's absolutely nothing in the trend that we've seen in those 400 years that would correlate with the very dramatic warming that we've seen just over the last 100 years. And since 1978, we've had very, very precise readings of solar intensity. And it does vary. There are dark spots and bright spots, and it appears to follow a pretty regular 11-year cycle. But once again, within that, there's no discernible upward or downward trend. And yet, in that timescale of the last 40 years, we've seen very substantial warming of the atmosphere. The next one is that this is one of the other commonly advanced skeptical positions, which is that it's actually the result of natural sources of carbon dioxide. And it is true that natural sources, such as swamps and volcanoes and so on, the volumes that you're talking about of CO2 and methane from those are far larger than man-made sources. But if you just think back to that data, the Vostok ice core data, what you see there is that CO2 levels have varied within a fairly even band. So the sources of CO2, the natural sources of CO2, have been balanced by the natural sinks. And it was maintained in a relatively steady state. Now, the other thing that we can tell from atmospheric carbon is that by comparing different isotopes of carbon, you can get a pretty good picture of where that's come from. Fossil fuels have virtually no radioactive isotopes left because they're very, very old, so most of the half-lives have decayed. And all the increases in CO2 that we've seen over the last 150 years can be attributed to anthropogenic emissions. So I would argue, therefore, that argument really doesn't hold water either. But both of those have been used extensively by, often by quite big organizations that have been set up to undermine climate science. And arguably, there was no organization that did that more effectively or more aggressively than the Global Climate Coalition. That was a grouping of big businesses, a lot of them oil industries and car industries, set up in the mid-80s. And critics accused them of using underhand tactics to undermine climate science. And what happened was that they gradually started to find it more and more difficult to maintain unity amongst their members, particularly after the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued their first and then their second report. And what happened was that one of their most prominent members broke ranks. And Lord Brown, who was the chief executive of BP at the time, issued this quite historic speech in a way, in which he said that the time to consider the policy dimensions of climate change is not when the link between greenhouse gases and climate change is conclusively proven, but when the possibility cannot be discounted. We in BP have reached that point. So they left the Global Climate Coalition. They were promptly followed by a number of others, including Shell and Ford and Daimler Chrysler and so on. And then in 2001, the whole grouping was disbanded. And I would contend that that particular skeptical position died at that point. That was the last really strong defense of that. And yet somehow the media still implies that there is a lot of doubt around, implying that this argument is still quite evenly balanced. But in 2004, there was a very extensive study done of every academic paper written in peer-reviewed scientific journals about global warming. It was a total of 928 scientific papers, and not one of those disagreed with the consensus that climate change was happening and that it was largely the result of anthropogenic emissions. The next skeptical position I'm going to talk about is this one that I hear quite a bit, which is how do we know this isn't just environmentalists exaggerating? And the argument goes, well, these Greens have been predicting the end of the world for decades now, and it never happens, and so on. And I think the best way of responding to this is by looking at this book, which I'd really highly recommend, by Jared Diamond, called Collapse. And what Diamond does in this book is that he looks at a whole series of civilizations throughout history that have prospered for a time and then they have collapsed. And he draws out of those examples common factors, and it's normally one or two or sometimes three of these factors that are the result that produce that collapse in the civilization. And you can see that these look very familiar: overpopulation, deforestation, soil problems, water management, climate change, etc., etc. And at the end of the book, Diamond argues that Whereas a lot of these collapses that occurred in the past were limited by the geographical regions, so such as Easter Island or the Greenland Norse or the Anasazi Indians. Now that we're a very globalized society, if a collapse were to occur, it's likely to occur on a much broader scale. But I think that the really key point that he makes is that these kind of collapses have occurred in the past. And so there's every reason to believe that if we carry on with business as usual, we'll experience a similar collapse in the future. I think the other point to make is that increasingly we're seeing fairly sober types who are making fairly alarming statements about climate change. It's not just hysterical environmentalists. So this was Lord Stern speaking at the RIBA towards the end of last year, where he said that these are big risks of a planetary catastrophe, and bear in mind that I was brought up to understate things rather than exaggerate. So the next skeptical position is this one: it's not up to architects to tackle climate change. And I'm going to talk about this graph, which perhaps looks a little boring, but it is worth getting your head around. This was the result of a very detailed study by the management firm McKinsey, and they assessed all the common methods of carbon abatement in terms of their cost and their scope and how possible it was to implement those. And all the stuff that is below the line is stuff that would actually save money, and then the stuff that is above the line is stuff that would cost money. So you have things like building insulation, lighting systems, air conditioning, water heating, fuel efficiency in vehicles, and so on. And then going through to the much more complicated things and more expensive things like carbon capture and storage, photovoltaics, and so on. And what you can see from that is that nearly all the easy, quick wins that would bring about the biggest carbon reductions for the minimum investment, nearly all of those are to be found in the building industry. So as architects, more often than not, we are leading the design team. We're the lead consultant. We initiate a lot of the ideas. We coordinate the work of the other consultants. And although occasionally we do get overruled by clients, on the whole, clients hire architects in order to advise them. And generally speaking, they will listen to architects' advice. So I think architects are uniquely powerful, actually. We're arguably one of the most powerful characters in the industry. And certainly if you compare the potential that we have to make a difference with other professionals like doctors or lawyers or whatever, there's no comparison. There's an absolutely vast amount that we can do. And there are some very promising schemes that have been completed, passive house schemes that have achieved a 90% reduction in energy use, BedZ, which was designed to One Planet Living standards, and the example of Woking Borough Council, where they managed to achieve 70% reductions in carbon emissions and save themselves 5 million quid during the first 10 years. And they did that by implementing all the easy wins first and then using those savings to work their way further and further up the graph. So I feel there is a very strong case for saying that architects can take a lot of action on climate change. That's just a shot of One Brighton, which is the scheme that in a way followed on from BedZ. This is one that Bioregionals just completed in Brighton, built to zero carbon standards for no extra cost. And then this is the Wessex Water Operations Centre by Bennett's Associates, the highest BREEAM rated building ever. Only about 3% more than standard cost buildings, and it uses a fraction of the amount of energy. So there are a lot of very positive examples of schemes that have been built that show we can do a lot. This is getting into one of the more difficult skeptical positions. There are higher priorities for us to tackle than climate change. And the most vocal proponent of this position is a chap called Bjorn Lomborg, who some of you may have heard of. He wrote a book a while ago called The Skeptical Environmentalist, which in many ways was a sort of full-on assault on the environmental movement. And it claimed that all the data had been exaggerated, and actually pretty much everything is getting better. We've got more food, less starvation, et cetera, et cetera. And more recently, Lomborg set up a grouping called the Copenhagen Consensus. And that was a grouping of some of the world's top economists, in his words. And they set themselves the challenge of saying, okay, just supposing we had $50 billion to spend, how could we spend that to achieve the greatest possible global good? And they assessed 16 different things and they came to the conclusion that climate change was the lowest priority on that list. And right at the top was things like tackling HIV/AIDS in Africa, water projects, malnutrition, free trade, and so on. And initially, their arguments do sound quite convincing, and they've certainly been rather too successful in persuading governments to delay action on climate change. But if you actually look into it in detail, you find that a lot of their arguments start to fall apart. And firstly, the figures that they're using for the carbon cost-benefit analysis are way out of date, I would argue. They use a figure of $2 per tonne as the damage done by emitted carbon. And just one example, Stern reckons the figure should be about $85 a tonne. They also assume that it costs at least $20 a tonne to cut a tonne of carbon dioxide. And what we saw from that McKinsey cost curve is that there's a hell of a lot that you can do that actually saves money rather than costs money. But I think another problem with their position is that choice between either tackling problems of developing countries or tackling climate change is really a false dichotomy. And here's one reason why it's a false dichotomy. Most of the persuasive models for how we could bring about global reductions in carbon emissions such as the contraction convergence model, most of these would actually result in a net transfer of wealth from the developed world to the developing world through carbon quotas and domestic tradable quotas and so on. So as a result of bringing about carbon emissions, this would actually help the developing countries develop in a sustainable way and get their population growth under control, get out of the poverty trap of subsistence, agriculture, and so on. But I think the other problem with that Copenhagen consensus position is that it was largely the result of a group of economists sitting in a room with calculators. And I think it's quite dangerous, well, very dangerous actually, to assume that all the world's problems can be worked out and solved by economists with calculators. And here's one example. This is a photograph of part of the Himalayan glacier field. And about 40% of the world's population depends on summer meltwater from Himalayan glaciers. And with unabated climate change, by 2050, quite a lot of those glaciers will have disappeared. And with that, the sustenance for hundreds of millions of people. So, you know, if Lomborg thinks that you can put a value on something like this, then I'd suggest he's been spending a bit too much time with his calculator and not enough time with human beings. It should be big companies that invest in tackling climate change, but why would a company put themselves at a competitive disadvantage to others? Well, I think this position did have some validity some time ago, but what we've seen particularly in the last 5 years is a massive acceleration in the amount of corporate social responsibility reporting done by big companies. And increasingly, we're seeing really big household names such as Marks and Spencer's setting themselves very demanding targets. And these four names, which includes one or two that perhaps we're more accustomed to associating with corporate villainy, these all have really bold targets that they're aiming for. Coca-Cola are working with the Rocky Mountain Institute. B-Sky-B have set themselves a target of being carbon neutral by, I think, 2012. Rio Tinto are working with the WWF and the Eden Project, completely transforming the way they do their business. And I really think there's been a fundamental shift from the kind of attitude that prevailed when the Global Climate Coalition was set up to what we have now. In those days, it was quite common to find big companies clubbing together to actually campaign against any kind of environmental initiatives or environmental legislation. Now you're even seeing some of these companies clubbing together to lobby in favor of tighter regulation so that they can all compete on a level playing field. The next one is this: isn't it up to governments to tackle this? And I think that there is quite a bit of validity to this. It's certainly true that governments could have and should have done a lot more to address climate change. The Bush administration, in my opinion, set things back at least 10 years. But you know, we shouldn't underestimate how difficult it is going to be to achieve this. What we need is a level of global cooperation virtually unprecedented in history. there are some positive examples of global cooperation before. You know, the Montreal Protocol was a global initiative that limited the emissions of CFCs and has been very successful. The ozone hole is actually recovering. So there are reasons to be optimistic, and I think everyone is optimistic that the US will be coming to the climate change talks in December with a much more positive attitude under the new administration. And I've put a second one in here because I think this is part of the same position, really. You know, what is the point in us busting a gut when China builds a new coal-fired power station every week? Well, before we set about kind of bashing China, I think we should remember that there's still a big difference between the emissions from the average person in China and the developed world. So these are the per capita carbon emissions from different countries. And generally at this end, you've got the USA, Canada, most of the European developed nations. And then right at that end, you've got China. That bar chart does go on, by the way. China's not by no means the lowest. But it has about a third of the per capita carbon emissions of the UK. And China actually looks to Europe, and I believe to the UK in particular, for leadership on this. And it was partly that reason that led them to appoint Arup to design the new eco-city in Dongtan. And if this gets realized as it's been planned, it'll be a truly radical bit of urban design. The first bit of urban design ever to be designed to a one-planet eco-footprint. And I think it's also fair to say that you know, the UK historically has absolutely massive carbon emissions because we were one of the first countries to industrialize. And given that we led the world into the carbon age, I think there's a very good case for saying that we should lead the world out of it. So just to wrap up this first part now, you know, climate change is a reality. The science is looking ever more alarming. Climate scientists met again in March and concluded that their previous predictions for sea level rises were way too conservative, and we're likely to see sea level rises of over a meter this century. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the Greenland ice shelf is breaking up far faster than predicted. If that were to collapse and into the sea, then we would see sea level rises of about 6 meters. We're also seeing a massive acceleration in the extinction of species, which is quite likely to lead to ecosystem collapses and so on. And often when faced with an enormous challenge, our first reaction is to refuse to accept that it's a reality. And this is particularly common amongst people who are diagnosed with life-threatening conditions. But generally speaking, those people are encouraged to actually work through that to a state of acceptance and then a state of action. And I believe in many ways we're in a similar position with our attitudes to climate change, because all of these skeptical positions are in some way a refusal to accept the reality. You know, starting with it's not happening to it is happening and it's nothing to do with us. It is something to do with us, but there's nothing we can do about it. We can do something about it, but it's not our responsibility. It is our responsibility, but we're not going to do anything because, and so on. So I feel that those positions are largely untenable, but also really quite uninspiring, and that it's much more courageous and inspiring to actually take on that challenge, to accept that it's a reality, and to do something about it. And that's what I want to talk about in the second part of the talk. But just before I do that, are there any kind of skeptical positions that I haven't covered? Are there any remaining doubts that people want to raise about climate change and the science of climate change? No? Okay, fine. Okay, well, in the second part, I'm gonna, as I said at the beginning, this is about one way in which an architect can respond to the challenges of climate change. It's something that I'm particularly interested in. It's a relatively new discipline, biomimicry, and this was something that I really got interested in working on the Eden project. And the thing that really appeals to me about biomimicry, it's all about looking at examples from nature as a source of inspiration for new solutions. The thing that I find really appealing about biomimicry is that it's a transformative approach, and it allows you to go well beyond conventional approaches to sustainability. And I think there are two really big transformations that we need to make. And this connects quite well with some of the stuff that John was talking about. The first of those is shifting from a linear wasteful, polluting way of using resources to a completely closed-loop model. And the second is the difficult and dramatic shift from a carbon economy to a solar economy. And on both of those, I think biomimicry has a hell of a lot of solutions to offer. So just before we start to talk about this, this is a clip, well, it's a slide from Stanley Kubrick's 2001. And it's the moment when the bone has been chucked up in the air, and just before it changes into the spaceship orbiting a distant planet. And I think what we see in those first 20 minutes of 2001 is a whole series of distinctions about the ascent of humans. And I believe that the point that Kubrick was trying to make with this cut from the bone to the spaceship, but arguably the most amazing temporal cut in cinematic history, I think the point he was trying to make is that once humans had discovered fire, how to make tools and weapons and so on, it was really just a matter of time before we dominated our environment and kind of moved beyond the limits of our natural world. And so it's quite easy to think of humans as being sort of omniscient and all-powerful and dominating nature and so on. And certainly a lot of the things that humans have produced, such as modern medicine, the digital revolution, they're absolutely remarkable. But at the same time, there are some things that we've made a hell of a mess of. And I think it is difficult to look at examples in the natural world without feeling a certain sense of humility about humans. So for instance, termites have evolved zero-waste sustainable architecture, solar-powered air conditioning, even sustainable agriculture. And that's something that humans in the 20th century really struggled with. And then another example, this is aramid fiber. This demonstrates the difference between the way man makes things and the way that nature does things. This is aramid fiber, or Kevlar by another name, the strongest fiber that humans have ever made. And the way that you make that is that you take petroleum, you boil it in sulfuric acid at 750 degrees centigrade, then following the principle that if brute force doesn't work, you clearly haven't used enough, you add extremes of pressure to get the molecules into place. Out of that, you get your fiber, and you get a lot of toxic waste. So extremes of pressure, extremes of temperature, loads of energy, loads of pollution, and all that to do the same as a spider does at room temperature with raw materials of dead flies and water. You know, it does suggest that we've still got quite a bit to learn. And in many ways, that's the sort of background to biomimicry. The fact that there is this amazing storehouse of design ideas, this 3.5 billion year R&D period that we can benefit from. And when I talk about biomimicry, I tend to split it into three different strands. And those are looking at natural forms as a source of inspiration, looking at natural systems, and looking at natural processes. So I'm going to talk about three projects that demonstrate each of those streams of biomimicry. The first one is the Eden project that I was very fortunate to work on for 10 years while at Grimshaw's. And you know, it really was a revelation for us, seeing how many things you can find in nature to help with the design process. And we turn to nature at every stage in the design process, from the very early stage, looking at the way that bubbles intersected, even through to the more detailed stages. We used dragonfly wings to help us resolve some of the steel junctions. And it was quite a tough site. It was a quarry that was still being mined, so we had no way of knowing what the final ground level was going to be. And we had to try and find an architectural idea that could maintain its integrity regardless of what the final ground levels were going to be. So the idea we came up with was to create this string of bubbles, and the diameter of those could be varied to provide the right growing height in the different parts of the building. And then the necklace line that joined those together, that could be varied to suit the topography. We had a rough idea of what the topography was going to end up like, but not much certainty about the final levels. And you can probably just make out there's a line running around that. That was the line formed by the intersection between this bubble model and the 3D terrain model. So if you cut away everything that's below that, that produced the first image that looks something like the finished building. The next challenge was to think about how to structure that. And we knew from a number of natural examples that the most efficient way of creating a spherical surface is by using a geodesic structure, hexagons and pentagons. Then we had to think about how to enclose that. And we needed to find an alternative to glass, because glass is very heavy and quite limited in terms of its unit sizes. So we were familiar with this material, ETFE, which is a high-strength polymer. And the way that you use this is that you put it together in 3 layers you weld it around the edge and then you inflate it. And it's that inflation that gives it its rigidity. And the fantastic thing about this material was that you could get it in very large unit sizes. With glass, you're limited to about 10 square meters. Here, the biggest hexagons were about 70 square meters. And it was 1% of the weight of double glazing. So in that respect, it represents a factor 100 saving, achieving the same result, but with 1/100th of the resource input. And we found that we got into a sort of positive cycle in which one breakthrough facilitated another. So with such large units, it meant that we had less steel. With less steel, we were getting more sunlight coming in, which meant that we didn't have to put as much additional energy in winter. With less overall steel weight, it meant that we saved a hell of a lot on the substructure. And at the end of the project, I had very accurate figures for the volume of this building and for the weight of that superstructure. And it turned out that the superstructure was actually lighter than the weight of the air inside the building. And having been through that process, if we had just a slightly bigger budget, slightly better building technology, I'm confident that we could reduce that steel weight by perhaps a factor of another 4. And the way that we could do that is by learning some further tricks from nature. In nature, material is expensive and design is cheap. So what you find is that material is used incredibly sparingly, very efficiently. And in this example of a bone, on the left you can see a diagram of the stresses going through that bone. On the right you can see where the bone concentrates its filaments. And the filaments of bone exactly match the stress diagram. So you have a lot of bone where there's high stresses and no material where there's no stress. And clearly, we can't achieve molecular level manufacturing, which is what nature does, but potentially we can start to approximate it, particularly if rapid prototyping were to shift to rapid manufacturing, because that allows you to turn a computer model directly into a physical model or potentially a building product. So if we could make steel tubes that just had the steel where it needed to be, then they would be bigger in the middle where the bending moments are highest, and they'd be very small at the ends. And I reckon that would allow us to take out a huge amount of further steel weight from that building. So the Eden project is, I think, quite a good example of how you can use natural forms as a source of inspiration to lead on to completely new solutions. And it allowed us to completely reinterpret what was quite an established building type and come up with a scheme that was radically better in terms of the material it was using, in terms of the energy required to run it, and so on. So the next stream that I mentioned of biomimicry was looking at natural systems. And this project was another botanical visitor attraction, so quite similar to the Eden project in some respects, but this time up in the north of England, between Liverpool and Manchester. And we had another tough site. It was a landfill facility. And the client, I think, just expected us to ignore the landfill because it was quite a big site. And I think they just imagined we would build something alongside it. But they'd mentioned that they wanted it to be zero carbon. And there was, it was really quite a shocking thing going to see a landfill facility. It was the first time I'd been and seen one in the flesh. And it really does bring it home to you what a ridiculous idea this is, taking all these valuable minerals and resources out of the ground, turning them into short life products and then chucking them back into the ground. It's just so last century. So we decided that we wanted to do something about this and respond to it in some way. And there was this very nice little project that we were aware of at the time called the Cardboard to Caviar project, done by the Kirklees and Calderdale Green Business Network. And in their area, they had quite a few posh restaurants. And generally speaking, this is the way that those restaurants were working. Highly packaged food stuff coming in at one end, going through the restaurant and getting a lot of food, cardboard and plastic waste at the other. Most of that was going to landfill. So what they suggested was that the food waste and the plastic waste could be separated for composting and recycling. That much is fairly obvious. The really clever bit is what they did with the cardboard waste, because they were paid to collect that. They then shredded it and sold it to equestrian centres for horse bedding. Then when that was soiled, they were paid again to collect it. They put it into wormery composting systems, which produced a lot of worms, which they fed to Siberian sturgeon, which produced caviar, which they sold back to the restaurants. Which is quite nice, because it's a bit like a form of alchemy, turning a very low-value material into a high-value material. But the other thing it's done is that it's turned a linear, wasteful system into a closed-loop system. And that's exactly the way that natural systems work. In ecosystems, all the waste from one organism becomes a nutrient for some other kind of organism within the system. So we thought that was quite fun, and we thought it'd be great if we could do something as clever with our scheme. We also thought very carefully about what had worked well at the Eden project and what we might want to do slightly differently given another opportunity. And the thing that everyone seemed to relate to, you know, every age group from school kids all the way through to saga louts, was this idea of the jungle, you know, the rainforest. So pretty early on we fixed on that as the concept for the project, that we were going to try and recreate a sample of rainforest on our site. And for this to be very much about ecosystems and the importance of understanding the interrelationship of species. We also thought carefully about how to get the maximum educational benefit and the maximum sort of visitor drama out of this. And we thought it'd be great if you could come in at high level, get a view out over the journey you're about to go on, maybe come in next to a waterfall so that all your senses are engaged by the heat and the steam and the sound. And then with lightweight walkways running through the treetops, you could start to explore all the vertical dimensions of the rainforest, looking at all the different ecological niches, gradually working your way down through the canopy, the sub-canopy, ending up at the forest floor. And with a zoological license, they could include a whole range of animals and fulfill this educational idea about it being about ecosystems. So we still had to tackle this challenge of it being a zero carbon scheme. And we looked back through the history of greenhouses to see if there are any good examples. And generally speaking, they were all fossil fuel based. But there was this one at Heligan Gardens, which is quite close to the Eden project, that we really got interested in. There was a time in British history when there was quite a craze amongst the aristocracy for growing pineapples. And if you had a fresh pineapple in the middle of your table, it was a sort of ultimate status symbol at the time. And what resulted was a whole range of ingenious little pineapple sheds. But for me, this is by far the best. Because what they did here is they created these stepped beds on which they planted the pineapples, south-facing glass roof. And then on the south side and the north side, they had these double walls. And they loaded fresh manure into that. And just the heat from that decomposing was enough to get the growing area up to a temperature of 75 degrees Fahrenheit. So that was the first time anyone had grown a zero carbon pineapple in the UK. And of course that reintroduced the whole subject of waste, because if we moved away from a conventional approach to waste to a more enlightened approach, you can see that a lot of those waste streams can be turned into building products. So inert waste, which is basically rubble, you can put that into gabion walls and make walls. Paper into insulation, glass, metal, recycles, etc., etc. The big one is biodegradable waste. Nearly 60% of what goes into landfill is biodegradable waste. So if we put that into biodigesters, then that could be the source of our low-grade, the low-grade heat source for our carbon-neutral heating system. The first sketch was really quite similar to the pineapple sheds, but massively scaled up. We'd build up these walls out of stockpiled rubble waste. We'd have a south-facing glass roof so that for a lot of the year the building would be self-heating just based on passive solar gain and a lot of thermal mass. And then within those walls we would set these vertical biodigesters so that during the colder times of the year you could draw the heat off those and use that to heat the building. And that started to drive the form of the architecture, because it wasn't just about achieving the biggest clear span. What we needed now was more wall surface area relative to the volume. So that led to this plan form based on 3 overlapping circles. And all those circles you can see around the perimeter are the vertical biodigesters. And if we look at it in section now, you can see some of the ideas I was talking about a few minutes ago, coming in at high level next to a waterfall, circulating around the perimeter through all the different layers of the ecosystem. And then within the walls, you can see the biodigesters. So this is really a sort of city-scale composting operation. And I think we ended up giving the client far more than they expected. It was really quite a small study, a very small fee, and that made it all the more annoying when they didn't do anything with it. But never mind, we did quite a bit more work with Bureau Happold, looking at some of the economic benefits of this approach. And just the value of the heat, landfill tax, compost value, that would give us £9.5 million a year before you have a single visitor through the door. So with that scheme, I think that's a fairly good example of how you can look at the amazing efficiencies of natural systems and closed loop systems and use that as a way of really transforming what is currently a massive problem, landfill, into a huge opportunity. And you know, there was a time, pretty recently actually, when whenever you went to a conference about sustainability, there'd be some architects there talking about it with the diagram of the 3 overlapping circles representing economic, social, and environmental sustainability. And the implication was that you need to be prepared to compromise on each of those and aim for that sort of sweet spot in the middle. Well, I think biomimicry offers a lot of solutions that allow you to get those circles to pretty much overlap and to come up with solutions that are better not just for the planet, but also for people and profit as well. So the third and final part of biomimicry that I'm talking about is learning from natural processes. So this is a scheme that I've been working on since I set up my own company, working with Bill Watts of Max Fordham's office and a chap called Charlie Payton. And the hero for this project is the Namibian fog-basking beetle, which is just an absolutely fantastic creature. Sometimes I actually think I'm only a sort of part-time architect, and the rest of the time I seem to be a sort of media promoter for this beetle. But it is pretty remarkable. This guy has evolved a way of harvesting its own fresh water in a desert location. And the way that it does this is that it has this matte black shell, and it comes out of its hiding place at night, and it's able to radiate heat out to the night sky and become just slightly cooler than its surroundings. So when the moist breeze blows in off the sea, you get these droplets of water forming on the beetle's shell. And then just before the sun comes up, the beetle tips its shell up, the water runs down to its mouth, it has a good drink, and then goes off and hides for the rest of the day. Not a great quality of life, perhaps, but it is a clever trick. And that ingenuity, if you could call it that, goes even further, because you can probably just make out there are little bumps on the beetle's shell. And the tops of those bumps are hydrophilic, they attract water. And between the bumps is a waxy finish which repels water. And that means that as the water forms, it tends to stay in very tight droplets, spherical droplets, which means it's much more mobile than it would be if it was just a film of water. So even when there's only a small amount of moisture available in the air, the beetle is still able to harvest that really efficiently and conduct it down to its mouth. So it's an absolutely classic example of an amazing adaptation to a very resource-constrained environment. And in that sense, I think biomimicry has a huge amount to offer us for the kind of challenges that we're going to face this century. So there were a couple of other things that were very much in our minds when we were thinking about this project. One was to try and find solutions to global water shortages, and water is really coming up the agenda in terms of its potential for causing conflicts through resource shortages. And there are large parts of the developing world that are dependent on very unsustainable sources of water, groundwater that is being extracted at such a rate that it's starting to turn saline. And also peak oil. John talked quite a bit about peak oil, so I won't mention that much. Only to say that in a way I find it quite amusing when people argue really vociferously about whether peak oil has already happened or whether it's in 10 years or 20 years. Because if you change the time axis, it does kind of end the argument. And what you're looking at there with that descent curve is either the most dramatic period of behavioral and technological change we've ever seen, or it's something a whole lot less pretty. Some people point to nuclear, but uranium has its own peaking scenarios. And at the moment, we only get 3.5% of our net energy from nuclear. So if there was a big shift towards nuclear, then you're just likely to see those peaking scenarios coming much further forward. So I would argue that at best, nuclear is a short-term stopgap, and at worst, it's a dangerous distraction from what we really need to be doing. And what we really need to be doing is making that difficult shift from a carbon economy to a solar economy. And various people have been applying peak oil theories to other resources. And this is one that actually looks quite worrying, because this suggests that phosphate production has already peaked. And phosphate is used to a massive extent in our industrialized agricultural systems. So if we start running out of phosphate, there's a very real chance that we'll start running out of food. So the starting point in many ways for this project was a scheme called the seawater greenhouse. And the seawater greenhouse was invented by this guy, Charlie Payton, who I'm working with. And it's a greenhouse for coastal arid regions. And it uses a process very similar to the beetle. And in essence, what you have is a wall of evaporators at the front, and you trickle seawater over those. So as the onshore breeze blows through that, it picks up a lot of moisture and is cooled in the process. So that means inside you have cool, humid air. So that's a much better growing environment for crops in arid regions. The roof has a double layer of polymer. And the lower layer is opaque to infrared, which plants don't need, generally speaking. So that cuts out further heat. And then there's also an arrangement of black pipes in the roof that has seawater passing through them. And then that hot seawater from the roof goes through a second evaporator at the back. So as the air is passing through the greenhouse at that point, the temperature is raised and it can take on a lot more moisture. And then you have a series of vertical polythene tubes through which cooled seawater is passed. And that cooled seawater comes from the bottom of the front evaporator. So at that point, you've got hot, humid air meeting a large amount of cool surface, just like the beetle's shell. And what you get is a lot of distilled water condensing out and running down to the bottom where you can collect it. And the thing that was remarkable about this scheme was that it was actually producing more water than it needed for the plants inside to grow. And this first one, built in Tenerife, was nowhere near a town, so they weren't too sure what to do with this surplus water, and they just started spreading it on the land around. And so the difference that that made from this picture taken after completion to 2 years later, it looked like that. So it's been like a green ink blot spreading out from the building, turning barren land back into biologically productive land. And in that sense, I think you could argue that it goes beyond sustainable design to achieve restorative design. So that was one of the things that we were really keen to explore further. We wanted to scale this up and maximize those benefits and to apply various other biomimicry principles to the scheme. So we know from the 3 that have been built that they evaporate about 50 tons of seawater per hectare per day. So if you were to scale that up massively to, for example, something on this scale, this is 20,000 hectares of polytunnels and environmental disgrace, otherwise known as Almeria in southern Spain. A horrendously unsustainable form of agriculture, produces thousands of tons of plastic waste every year, and is all based on groundwater, which is turning saline. So the Spanish government are building a whole string of fossil fuel desalination plants around the coast. Shame, because if that was seawater greenhouses, that region would be a net producer of distilled water. But anyway, just take that figure of 20,000 hectares, multiplied by 50 tons per hectare per day. That would be evaporating about 1 million tons of seawater per day. So if we were to create a scheme of that sort of scale, then ideally we wouldn't want to have to pump that water, because that would involve a lot of energy. So we've identified various places on land that are actually below sea level, depressions, and there are quite a few of these around. So if we could find some of these that allowed us to get a sea pipe to that location, then we could bring in unlimited quantities of seawater just under gravity. The other advantage of coming inland is that the air is much, much drier. On the coast, the relative humidity is about 70%. Inland, it's about 30%. And just that difference means that we could evaporate about 3 times as much fresh water. Sorry, evaporate about 3 times as much seawater and create that much more fresh water. Now, when we think about nature, we often think about it being all about competition. And that's certainly true up to a point. And the German film director Werner Herzog says that nature is just chaos and murder. I mean, it's partly right, but actually in mature ecosystems, you're just as likely to find really amazing examples of organisms that have hooked up to create symbiotic benefits. And so a fundamental principle of biomimicry is to try and find or try and create examples of synergistic design, symbiotic relationships. So we looked around for other types of technology that could be symbiotic with the seawater greenhouse. And the one that was absolutely ideal was this one, concentrated solar power. The principle of this is that you use solar tracking mirrors to focus the sun's heat onto a point and use that heat to turn water to steam to drive turbines. And it produces electricity twice as efficiently as photovoltaics. And it's got some very interesting synergies. First of all, both technologies work very well in hot, sunny desert locations. Concentrated solar power needs a supply of demineralized water to keep the mirrors clean. And that happens to be exactly what the seawater greenhouse produces. CSP produces a lot of waste heat. We could make use of all that waste heat to evaporate more seawater and create more fresh water. And we think that with the combination of an inland location and concentrated solar power, we could create perhaps 5 or even 10 times as much fresh water as the standard seawater greenhouse. And this gives some idea of the potential for concentrated solar power. This was from an article in one of the broadsheets claiming that that square, 273 kilometers by 273 kilometers, if that were concentrated solar power plants, that would meet the world's electricity demand. And I must admit, I was a little skeptical when I saw that. So I did my own calculation. It's pretty easy to do. I just looked up the surface area of the Earth, looked up an average figure for solar radiation at the surface, and it turns out that we receive about 10,000 times as much energy from the sun every year as we use in energy from all forms. And I'm not pretending that this shift to a solar economy is going to be an easy one, but that statistic does at least suggest that it's possible. So the challenge is one of it being a challenge to our ingenuity, and it's a challenge that is well worth a try, if you ask me. So the idea really was to create this long hedge of greenhouses with concentrated solar power plants along the way, benefiting from these synergies. And then this image shows all the main elements of the scheme. You've got the sea in the top right, connected by a sea pipe, 3 strips of seawater greenhouse, producing crops within and between the greenhouses, also producing surplus water for human consumption, and then concentrated solar power plants along the way. Another important principle of biomimicry is thinking about anything that is underexploited, anything that is a waste, that should be regarded as an opportunity. And clearly, if you're evaporating vast quantities of seawater, then you're going to be left with a lot of salts. And it's interesting that different things crystallize out at different stages. The first thing to crystallize out is actually calcium carbonate. And the image on the left there is of one of the evaporator panels from the seawater greenhouse after it's been in use for some time, gradually getting encrusted with calcium carbonate. And we could allow that to continue, and then once it's really heavily encrusted, we could take that out and put in a fresh one. And incidentally, it's very simple technology. It's just corrugated waxed cardboard. So if we take out that encrusted block, then that's an artificial limestone block, and we could actually use that as a lightweight building block. And the carbon in that would have come out of the atmosphere into the sea and then into a building product. The next one to crystallize out is sodium chloride, and there are lots of industrial applications for that, so we could actually sell some of that. But at the moment, we're just joking that we're going to try and satisfy Waitrose's demand for overpriced and pompously packaged table salt. Some might say that demand is insatiable, but we think we'd give it a good go. The next one to crystallize out is magnesium chloride. And that's actually a very valuable compound because you can use that as a desiccant in low-energy cooling systems. One of the most benign ways of achieving air conditioning is to use evaporative cooling and then desiccants. So in the very parts of the world where you would really benefit from some form of cooling, here we would have a supply of desiccant. And when I was doing some research into peak phosphate, I came across another application for magnesium chloride. Apparently, if you add it to human liquid waste, it forms a compound with nearly all the useful material. Apparently most of the phosphates and nitrates that pass through our body actually leave through our urine rather than our solid waste. So this forms a compound called struvite, which is a very valuable fertilizer. So we think there's scope for another Waitrose product there. Overpriced and pompously packaged urine salts. It's a winner. And after that, you get pretty much every element of the periodic table, even gold and uranium, but don't tell the uranium huggers. And we're certainly not going to be able to reclaim the gold viably, but we should be able to reclaim quite a lot of the elements within that seawater and use that to remineralize and fertilize the desert soil. Because at the moment, we have a very linear approach to our agriculture. We apply vast quantities of fertilizer to the soil. A lot of it gets washed straight into river systems and out to sea. Some of it passes through our bodies, and ultimately a lot of it is getting concentrated in the sea, where it's producing problems of eutrophication and so on. So this potentially could be a way of closing that loop. So the Sahara Forest Project is really a model for how we could create zero carbon food, abundant fresh water in some of the most water-stressed parts of the planet, clean energy, as well as revegetating areas of desert, and locking up vast quantities of carbon within the soils. There's a huge difference in the carbon content of fertile soils and sand. And it's worth bearing in mind that within recorded history, which in geological terms is like the blink of an eye, within recorded history, large parts of North Africa and the Middle East were actually dense cedar forest. And it was people like Emperor Hadrian who cut down vast areas to build navies and cities that produced, that started desertification that's been going on ever since. And most scientists agree that it was the colonization of land by plants that produced the benign climate that we currently enjoy. The converse is also true. The more the deserts grow, the more plants that we lose, the more that is likely to lead to, the more that's likely to exacerbate climate change and lead to further desertification. So there's a lot to be said for reversing that process. And now to just sort of return to some of the first themes, I firmly believe that biomimicry has a huge amount to offer. And for pretty much every challenge that we face, whether it's finding clean energy, manufacturing benign materials, harvesting fresh water, there'll be examples that we can turn to within nature that can point the way. And I'd be prepared to bet you that all of those would be completely closed loop, they'd be running on current solar income, and they'd be completely non-toxic. And you know, I feel that over the course of the history of architecture, the best contemporary architecture has always been some kind of creative response to the challenges of its age. So I'd really like to encourage architects to embrace the implications of climate change and use that as a way of shaping a really positive and optimistic and celebratory form of architecture. Thank you for listening.